The mountain wind howled through the pines as Andrea Robinson pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her breath coming in sharp bursts that turned to white vapor in the frigid air. Below her hiding place, three men on horseback circled like vultures, their voices carrying on the wind as they called out threats that made her blood run cold. She had been running for 2 days now, ever since she had witnessed what they had done to the trading post, ever since she had seen them murder old Samuel in cold blood for the few coins in his till. Her legs trembled beneath her woolen skirt, not just from the mall, but from exhaustion and the weight she carried on her frame. At 28, Andrea had always been what polite society called substantial, though the cruel tongues in town had used harsher words. Now, as she crouched in terror behind this tree, those extra pounds felt like chains dragging her towards certain death. She could hear her own labored breathing, too loud in the stillness, and pressed a hand to her mouth to muffle the sound. The late rider, a scarred man with dead eyes, called out again. His voice echoed off the canyon walls like the howl of some predatory beast. They knew she was here somewhere. They had tracked her this far, following the broken branches and disturbed earth that marked her clumsy flight through the wilderness. Andrea closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. Instead, all she could think about was how her sister had always said she was too heavy to do anything useful, too slow to matter, too much of a burden for anyone to truly care about. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, and Andrea knew her time was running out. She had no weapon save for a small knife meant for cutting bread, no horse to carry her to safety, and no strength left to run. The mountain stretched endlessly around her, beautiful and terrible in its vastness, and she realized with a kind of numb clarity that she was going to die here among these towering pines, alone and unmourned. Then she heard it, a sound that seemed to come from the very rocks themselves, a low whistle barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably human. Her eyes snapped open and she turned her head, searching for the source. There, perhaps 50 yards up the slope, she saw him, a man unlike any she had ever encountered, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of burnished copper and eyes like winter steel. He was mounted on a massive black stallion that stood motionless as carved stone, and he was looking directly at her. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their gazes locked across the distance. Andrea saw something in those pale eyes that she had never seen directed at her before, something that made her heart skip and her breath catch in her throat. Not pity, not disgust, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw not her failures and inadequacies, but something else entirely. Something she had never dared to believe existed within herself. The stranger raised one gloved hand and pointed toward a narrow trail that wound up through the rocks, barely visible among the shadows. Then he touched his finger to his lips in a gesture for silence and began to move, his horse picking its way down the treacherous slope with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. Andrea understood without words what he was offering, what he was asking of her, and the magnitude of the choice before her. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. She could stay here and wait for the inevitable, or she could trust this mysterious mountain man who had appeared like something out of a legend. The decision should have been simple, but Andrea's mind filled with all the reasons why it was impossible. She was too heavy, too slow, too much of a burden. What if she could not keep up? What if her weight caused them both to be caught? What if he realized what everyone else had always known, that she was simply too much trouble to be worth saving? The voices of her pursuers grew louder, more urgent. They had found her trail again, and they were closing in. Andrea looked once more at the stranger, who had now reached the bottom of the slope and was waiting in the shadows of a massive boulder. His horse stood perfectly still, ears pricked forward, alert but unafraid. The man himself sat with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to this wild place, who had made it his home and his kingdom. Something in his stillness, in the way he waited without impatience or judgment, gave Andrea the courage she needed. She pushed herself up from behind the tree, her legs shaking with more than cold, and began to make her way toward him. Each step felt like a monumental effort, her boots slipping on the loose stones and pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. Behind her, she could hear the riders spreading out, their horses snorting and stamping as they searched for her trail. When she reached the stranger, He looked down at her from his great height, and she saw that his face was weathered by wind and sun, marked by lines that spoke of hardship endured and overcome. There was a scar along his left temple, white against his tan skin, and his hands where they held the reins were scarred as well, the hands of a man who had known violence and survived it. He did not speak, but extended one of those scarred hands toward her. Andrea stared at it for a moment, knowing that if she took it, there would be no going back. She would be placing her life, her fate, entirely in the hands of this stranger. But as the sound of her pursuers grew ever closer, she realized she had already made her choice the moment she had stepped out from behind that tree. She reached up and grasped his hand, feeling the callous strength of his fingers as they closed around hers. He pulled her up behind him with an ease that stunned her, as if her weight meant nothing at all to him, as if she were as light as a child. For the first time in her adult life, Andrea felt what it was like to be lifted without strain or complaint, to be treated as if she were precious rather than burdensome. The horse beneath them was enormous, easily 17 hands high, with a back broad enough to carry them both without difficulty. Andrea settled behind the stranger, acutely aware of how her body pressed against his, expecting at any moment for him to tense with discomfort or annoyance. Instead, he simply gathered the reins and urged the horse forward, beginning their ascent up the narrow trail he had indicated earlier. The path was treacherous, little more than a deer track that wound between towering rock formations and across slopes of loose shale that shifted and slid beneath the horse's hooves. Andrea had never been on horseback before, and the motion terrified her at first. She clung to the stranger's coat, a garment made of some kind of thick leather that smelled of wood smoke and pine sap, and tried not to think about the drop that yawned beside them as they climbed higher and higher into the mountains. Behind them, she could hear shouts of anger and frustration as their pursuers discovered that their quarry had vanished. The voices grew fainter as they climbed, until finally they faded altogether, swallowed by the vast silence of the high country. Only then did Andrea allow herself to believe that they might actually escape, that this stranger had truly saved her from a fate too horrible to contemplate. As they rode, she became aware of other things. The way he sat his horse with perfect balance, moving with the animal rather than against it. The steady rhythm of his breathing, calm and controlled, even as they navigated the most dangerous sections of the trail. The warmth that radiated from his body, warming her where she pressed against his back. Most surprising of all, the way he seemed completely untroubled by her weight, as if carrying her was the most natural thing in the world. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, climbing ever higher into country that seemed to exist beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. The trees grew smaller and more twisted as they ascended, giving way to vast meadows carpeted with wildflowers that nodded in the mountain breeze. Eagles soared overhead, their cries echoing off the peaks that surrounded them on all sides, and Andrea began to understand that she had entered a world entirely different from the one she had known. When the stranger finally brought his horse to a halt, they were standing on a ledge that overlooked a valley so beautiful it took Andrea's breath away. Far below, a silver stream wound through meadows green as emeralds, while all around them the mountains rose like the walls of some vast cathedral. The air was thin and clean, filled with the scent of snow and pine, and something else, something wild and free that made her heart race with an emotion she could not name. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace and turned to help her down. Again, she was struck by the ease with which he lifted her, the complete absence of strain or effort in his movements. When her feet touched the ground, she found herself looking up into those winter-pale eyes, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, she felt truly safe. He was even taller than she had realized, probably 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His hair, which she had thought copper-colored from a distance, was actually a deep auburn shot through with gold, and it fell to his shoulders in waves that the wind stirred restlessly. He wore buckskin trousers and boots that came nearly to his knees, and the leather coat that had sheltered her during their ride. Everything about him spoke of self-sufficiency, of a man who had learned to depend on no one but himself. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of winter ice, but there was nothing cold about the way he looked at her. Instead, she saw a warmth there that made her feel as if she were standing before a fire on a cold night, as if something frozen inside her was beginning to thaw. He still had not spoken a word, and Andrea began to wonder if perhaps he could not speak. But then he smiled, just a slight curve of his lips, and she realized that he was simply a man of few words, someone who preferred action to speech. The smile transformed his face completely, softening the harsh lines and revealing a gentleness that took her completely by surprise. From somewhere in the folds of his coat, he produced a piece of jerked meat in a small leather water bag, offering them to her with a gesture that was somehow both courtly and utterly natural. Andrea realized that she had not eaten since the morning before, and the sight of food made her stomach clench with hunger. She accepted the offerings gratefully, too hungry to be embarrassed by her obvious need. The meat was unlike anything she had ever tasted, rich and smoky with a flavor that spoke of wild game and mountain herbs. The water was cold and sweet, tasting of snow and stone. As she ate, the stranger busied himself with his horse, checking the animal's hooves and adjusting the saddle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times. When she had finished eating, he looked at her expectantly, and Andrea realized that he was waiting for her to speak, to explain how she had come to be hiding in the forest with killers on her trail. The story came pouring out of her then, all the fear and horror of the past 2 days, the terrible things she had witnessed, the certainty that she was going to die alone and forgotten in these mountains. He listened without interruption, his pale eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the valley below as if weighing her words. Then he spoke for the first time, and his voice was like distant thunder, deep and resonant and somehow comforting. His name was Wayne Carter, and he had lived in these mountains for more than 10 years, ever since he had fled civilization and all its cruelties. He knew the men who were hunting her, knew them for the animals they were, and he promised her that they would not find her here. This was his domain, his kingdom, and he would protect her as long as she needed protection. The simple certainty in his voice, the complete absence of doubt or hesitation, made Andrea feel something she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, someone was promising to take care of her not out of duty or obligation, but because he chose to. Someone was looking at her not as a burden to be endured, but as a person worth saving, worth protecting, worth caring about. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Wayne led her to a sheltered cave hidden behind a curtain of falling water. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, with a ceiling high enough for even Wayne to stand upright and a floor covered with soft furs and woven blankets. A fire ring near the entrance showed that this place had been used as a shelter many times before. Wayne kindled a fire with practiced ease, and soon the cave was filled with warm, dancing light. He prepared a simple meal of fish caught from the stream below and wild vegetables gathered from the mountainside, cooking everything over the flames with a skill that spoke of years of solitary living. As they ate, he told her more about his life in the mountains, about the animals that were his neighbors and the seasons that marked the passage of time. Andrea found herself relaxing in a way she had not done in years, perhaps ever. There was something about Wayne's presence that made her feel accepted, valued, even cherished. He did not comment on her size or her appetite, did not make her feel ashamed of the space she occupied in the world. Instead, he treated her with a courtesy and consideration that she had never experienced from any man. As the fire burned lower and the night grew deeper, Wayne spread out furs near the warmth and indicated that she should rest. He settled himself near the cave entrance, his rifle across his knees, making it clear that he intended to stand guard while she slept. The gesture touched something deep in Andrea's mind, something that had been wounded so many times she had thought it could never heal. But sleep did not come easily. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of the waterfall and Wayne's steady breathing, Andrea found herself thinking about the day's events with a clarity that surprised her. She had been saved, rescued by a man who seemed to have stepped out of a fairy tale. But what happened now? She could not stay in this cave forever, could not expect Wayne to protect her indefinitely. Eventually, she would have to return to the world below, to face whatever consequences awaited her there. The thought filled her with a despair that was almost overwhelming. Down there, she was nobody special, just another spinster woman, too heavy and too plain to attract a husband, too poor to matter to anyone who counted. Up here, in Wayne's Mountain Kingdom, she felt like someone different, someone who might actually have value beyond her ability to cook and clean and stay out of the way. As if sensing her distress, Wayne's voice came softly through the darkness. He told her that she did not need to worry about tomorrow, that the only thing that mattered was that she was safe tonight. His words were simple, but they carried a weight of meaning that made her eyes fill with tears she was grateful he could not see. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail of the landscape stand out with startling clarity. Wayne was already awake when Andrea stirred, tending a small fire and preparing what smelled like the most wonderful breakfast she had ever encountered. The aroma of cooking meat and some kind of wild grain porridge filled the cave, making her stomach growl with anticipation. As they ate, Wayne explained that they could not stay in this place much longer. The men hunting her would eventually expand their search, and while he was confident in his ability to evade them, he preferred not to take unnecessary risks. He knew of another place, deeper in the mountains, where they would be completely safe from pursuit. But getting there would require a journey of several days through some of the most challenging terrain in the region. Andrea felt her heart sink at his words. Several days of hard travel, of being a burden on this man who had already done so much for her. She looked down at her own body, at the curves and softness that had always marked her as different, as less than other women, and felt the familiar shame wash over her. But when she tried to voice her concerns, to tell Wayne that she would only slow him down, that she was too heavy to make such a journey, he stopped her with a look that was both gentle and implacable. He told her that her size meant nothing to him, that he had seen her courage in the way she had trusted him enough to accept his help, in the way she had endured 2 days of terror without breaking completely. Then he said something that would echo in Andrea's mind for the rest of her life. He told her that strength came in many forms, that the body was just a vessel for the spirit within, and that he had seen something in her spirit that was worth more than all the conventional beauty in the world. The way he said it, with such quiet conviction, made her believe for the first time that it might actually be true. They set out that morning under a sky so blue it seemed almost artificial, like something painted on canvas by an artist with too much imagination. Wayne's horse, whose name was Thunder, carried them both with the same easy strength he had shown the day before. Andrea gradually relaxed into the rhythm of the ride, learning to move with the horse rather than against it, to trust in Wayne's skill and Thunder's sure-footedness. The country they traveled through was unlike anything Andrea had ever seen or imagined. Vast meadows filled with flowers in every color imaginable stretched between peaks that scraped the very sky. Crystal clear streams tumbled down from hidden glaciers, their water so pure it seemed to sing as it flowed over the rocks. Eagles and hawks soared overhead, while deer and elk grazed peacefully in the distance, unafraid of these human intruders in their domain. As they rode, Wayne began to talk more freely, telling her about the wildlife they encountered, the plants that could be eaten or used for medicine, the signs that predicted changes in the weather. His knowledge was encyclopedic, the result of years spent in intimate contact with this wild place. Andrea found herself fascinated not just by what he knew, but by the way he spoke about the mountains, with a reverence and love that was almost religious in its intensity. It became clear that Wayne was not just a man who lived in the mountains, but someone who had become part of them, who understood their moods and rhythms as intimately as he understood his own heartbeat. He showed her how to read the signs that warned of approaching storms, how to find water in seemingly barren country, how to move through the wilderness without leaving traces that could be followed. On their second day of travel, they encountered a challenge that tested everything Wayne had been teaching her. A sudden thunderstorm swept down from the peaks with little warning, bringing with it rain so heavy it was like standing under a waterfall and winds that threatened to knock them from their horse. Wayne guided Thunder to shelter beneath an overhanging rock, but the space was cramped and they were forced to huddle together for warmth. Andrea was acutely aware of Wayne's body pressed against hers, of the way his arms encircled her protectively as the storm raged around them. She had never been held by a man before, never experienced the feeling of being cherished and protected that his embrace provided. The sensation was overwhelming, filling her with emotions she had no name for and desires she had never dared to acknowledge. When the storm finally passed and they emerged from their shelter, Andrea felt as if something fundamental had changed between them. The way Wayne looked at her was different now, warmer and more personal, as if the intimacy forced upon them by the storm had awakened something in him as well. They did not speak of what had passed between them, but the awareness of it colored every interaction for the rest of the day. That evening, they made camp beside a lake so perfectly still, it reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror. Wayne caught fish for their dinner with his bare hands, a feat that seemed impossible until Andrea watched him do it with her own eyes. His movements were patient and precise, and when he finally struck, it was with the swift certainty of a natural predator. As they sat by their fire eating the fresh-caught fish, Wayne began to tell her about his life before the mountains, about the reasons he had fled civilization and sought refuge in this wild place. His story was one of loss and betrayal, of trust given and broken, of a man who had learned that the only way to avoid being hurt was to avoid other people altogether. He had been a soldier once, he told her, fighting in wars that seemed meaningless in retrospect. He had seen too much death, too much senseless cruelty, and when he finally came home, he found that the world he had left behind no longer existed. The woman he had loved had married another man, his family had scattered to the winds, and the town where he had grown up no longer felt like home. So he had come to the mountains, seeking solitude and peace, and had found both in abundance. For 10 years he had lived alone, content with the company of the wild creatures and the changing seasons. He had convinced himself that he needed no one, that solitude was not just preferable but necessary for his peace of mind. But then he said, looking directly into Andrea's eyes, he had seen her hiding behind that tree, terrified and alone, and something inside him had awakened that he thought was dead forever. The need to protect, to care for another person, to share the beauty and peace he had found in this place with someone who could appreciate it as he did. Andrea felt her heart racing as he spoke, understanding that he was telling her something profound and life-changing. This man, this magnificent, self-sufficient mountain man, was saying that she had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for a decade. The impossibility of it, the sheer wonder of being chosen by someone like Wayne Carter, left her speechless. But as the fire burned lower and the stars emerged in the clear mountain air, Andrea found her voice at last. She told Wayne about her own life, about the loneliness and rejection that had been her constant companions, about the way she had learned to make herself small and invisible to avoid the cruel comments and pitying looks that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She told him about her sister, who had taken her in after their parents died, but had never let her forget that she was a burden, a responsibility that no one else wanted, about the men in town who looked through her as if she did not exist, and the women who whispered behind their hands about the poor Robinson girl who would never find a husband, about the dreams she had given up, the hopes she had buried, the life she had convinced herself she did not deserve. Wayne listened to every word, his pale eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he reached across the dying fire and took her hand in his. His touch was gentle but firm, and the warmth of his skin against hers sent shivers through her entire body. He told her that everything she had experienced before this moment was past, that the people who had hurt her and diminished her were part of a world that no longer had any claim on her. Up here, in his mountain kingdom, she could be whoever she chose to be, could discover parts of herself that had been hidden beneath years of other people's expectations and judgments. The way he spoke, with such quiet certainty, made Andrea believe that it might actually be possible, that she might actually be able to leave behind the woman she had been, the woman who apologized for taking up space in the world and become someone new, someone worthy of the love she saw shining in Wayne's eyes. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped across the space between them, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. Andrea had never felt so peaceful, so completely at home in her own skin. For the first time in her adult life, she was not thinking about her weight, not worried about taking up too much space or being too much trouble. Wayne's presence seemed to create a bubble of acceptance around her, a space where she could simply be herself without apology or explanation. When they finally settled down to sleep, Wayne arranged their blankets close together, close enough that Andrea could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He did not touch her, but the knowledge that he was there, that she was under his protection, filled her with a sense of security she had never known before. The third day of their journey took them higher into the mountains than Andrea had ever imagined possible. They were above the tree line now, traveling through a landscape of stone and sky that seemed to exist at the very roof of the world. The air was thin and cold, and every breath required conscious effort. But the views were so spectacular that Andrea found herself gasping for reasons that had nothing to do with the altitude. Wayne showed her glaciers that had been carving these peaks for thousands of years, their blue-white ice gleaming like jewels in the morning sun. He pointed out the tracks of animals she had never heard of, creatures that lived in this high country and rarely descended to the world below. Mountain goats picked their way across seemingly impossible cliff faces, while golden eagles rode the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed rocks. As they climbed higher, Wayne began to tell her about their destination, a hidden valley that he had discovered in his third year in the mountains. It was completely enclosed by towering peaks, accessible only through a narrow pass that was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside the valley was everything needed for a comfortable life: fresh water, game, wild plants that could be cultivated into gardens, and shelter from the worst of the mountain weather. He had built a cabin there, he told her, a place where he retreated when the loneliness became too much to bear. It was not much by the standards of the civilized world, but it was solid and warm and completely private. No one else knew of its existence, and no one else had ever been there with him. The implication of his words was clear, and Andrea felt her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and terror. He was taking her to his most private place, his sanctuary, and the gesture felt more intimate than any physical touch could have been. She was going to be the first person to share his secret refuge, the first to see the home he had built with his own hands in this impossible place. When they finally reached the pass that led to Wayne's hidden valley, Andrea understood why he had been so confident that no one would ever find them there. The entrance was little more than a crack in the rock wall, barely wide enough for thunder to squeeze through, and completely invisible from more than a few yards away. Even knowing it was there, Andrea might have ridden past it without noticing. The passage through the rock was dark and narrow, with walls that seemed to press in from both sides. For a few terrifying moments, Andrea wondered if they were going to be trapped, crushed by the weight of the mountain above them. But then they emerged into sunlight so brilliant that it made her eyes go in water, and she found herself looking down into a valley so beautiful it seemed like something from a dream. The valley was perhaps 2 miles long and half as wide, completely enclosed by peaks that rose like the walls of a vast cathedral. A stream wound through the center, fed by a waterfall that tumbled down from the heights in a silver ribbon. The floor of the valley was carpeted with grass so green it seemed to glow, dotted with wildflowers in every color imaginable. Near the far end of the valley, nestled against the base of the eastern wall, stood Wayne's cabin. Even from a distance, Andrea could see that it was a substantial structure, built from logs that must have been carried down from the tree line and fitted together with the skill of a master craftsman. Smoke rose from its chimney, indicating that Wayne had arranged for the fire to be kept burning during their absence, and the sight of that homey detail made Andrea's eyes fill with tears. This was not just a shelter, she realized, but a home in the truest sense of the word. Wayne had not simply survived in this place, he had created something beautiful and lasting, something that spoke of permanence and belonging. The fact that he was sharing it with her, bringing her into this most private part of his life, felt like a gift beyond measure. As thunder carried them down into the valley, Andrea saw that Wayne had not been idle during his years of solitude. There were gardens near the cabin, carefully tended plots where vegetables and herbs grew in neat rows. A small corral held several horses, including a mare with a young foal that whinnied in greeting as they approached. Chickens pecked in a fenced yard, and she could see what looked like a smokehouse and root cellar built into the hillside. Wayne had created not just a home, but a complete homestead, a place where he could live in comfort and self-sufficiency, regardless of what happened in the outside world. The scope of his achievement was breathtaking, and Andrea found herself looking at him with new eyes, seeing not just the man who had rescued her, but the visionary who had built this paradise with his own hands. When they reached the cabin, Wayne dismounted and helped Andrea down from Thunder's back. Her legs were shaky from the long ride, and she found herself leaning against him for support, acutely aware of his strength and solidity. He steadied her with gentle hands, his touch sending waves of warmth through her entire body. The cabin was even more impressive up close than it had been from a distance. The logs were perfectly fitted, chinked with clay and moss to keep out the mountain cold. The roof was made of split shingles that had weathered to a soft gray, and the windows were real glass, not the oiled paper or animal hide that Andrea had expected. A wide porch ran across the front of the building, furnished with chairs carved from single pieces of wood and polished to a soft gleam. Inside, the cabin was a revelation. The main room was large and airy, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and windows that looked out over the valley. The furniture was all handmade, crafted with a skill and attention to detail that spoke of years of patient work. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that Wayne must have carried up from civilization at great effort and expense. The kitchen was fully equipped with everything needed for cooking and food preparation, including a cast-iron stove that must have been transported piece by piece through that narrow pass. A ladder led to a loft area that served as a bedroom, and Andrea could see that it too was furnished with the same care and attention to detail as the rest of the cabin, but it was the little touches that truly amazed her. Carved decorations on the furniture, colorful quilts that must have taken months to complete, dried flowers hanging from the rafters to scent the air. This was not the rough shelter of a hermit, but the carefully crafted home of a man who valued beauty and comfort, who had taken the time to create something worthy of the spectacular setting in which it stood. Wayne showed her around with obvious pride, pointing out features and improvements he had made over the years. He had installed a system for bringing fresh water into the cabin from the stream, had built a workshop where he crafted furniture and tools, had even created a small library where he kept journals documenting the weather patterns and wildlife of the valley. As Andrea explored this remarkable home, she began to understand something about Wayne that she had not fully grasped before. He was not a man who had fled civilization in defeat, but someone who had chosen to create his own version of it, one that reflected his values and priorities rather than those imposed by society. He had not simply survived in the wilderness, he had thrived, building something beautiful and lasting in this impossible place. That evening, as they sat before the fireplace eating a meal Wayne had prepared from ingredients grown in his own gardens, Andrea felt a contentment she had never experienced before. The cabin was warm and cozy, filled with the soft light of oil lamps and the comforting crackle of burning wood. Outside, the wind howled through the peaks, but inside they were safe and sheltered, cut off from the rest of the world in their mountain paradise. Wayne had given her clothes to replace her travel-stained dress, garments he had made himself from buckskin and wool. They fit her perfectly, and for the first time in her life, Andrea felt beautiful in what she was wearing. The clothes were designed for comfort and practicality rather than fashion, but they flattered her figure in a way that no dress from town ever had. As they talked by the fireplace, Wayne told her more about his life in the valley, about the rhythms of the seasons and the wildlife that shared this hidden place with him. He spoke of winters when the snow piled so deep that the cabin was nearly buried, of springs when the wildflowers turned the valley into a carpet of color, of summers when the days were so perfect they seemed to last forever. But increasingly, as the evening wore on, his conversation turned to the future, to the possibility that Andrea might choose to stay in this place permanently. He did not ask directly, did not pressure her for an answer, but she could hear the hope in his voice, could see the longing in his eyes as he spoke of sharing this life with someone who could appreciate its beauty and tranquility. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. To stay here would mean leaving behind everything she had ever known, abandoning the life she had built in town for something completely unknown. But as she looked around the cabin, at the evidence of Wayne's skill and dedication, at the home he had created in this impossible place, Andrea began to wonder if perhaps this was exactly what she had been searching for all her life without knowing it. Here, in this hidden valley, she would never again have to endure the pitying looks and cruel comments that had been her constant companions in town. Here, she would be valued not for her appearance or her ability to conform to society's expectations, but for who she truly was inside. Here, with Wayne, she could discover parts of herself that had been buried beneath years of shame and self-doubt. But even as these thoughts filled her with hope, Andrea could not shake the fear that she was not worthy of such happiness, that she was too damaged, too broken by years of rejection and loneliness to be the kind of partner Wayne deserved. What if she disappointed him? What if the reality of living with her day after day proved too much for even his generous heart to bear? As if sensing her internal struggle, Wayne moved closer to her on the hearth where they sat, his pale eyes searching her face in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice was soft but filled with conviction, and his words went straight to the heart of her fears. He told her that he had spent 10 years in solitude, convinced that he was better off alone, that human companionship brought only pain and disappointment. But seeing her, being with her, had shown him that he had been wrong. She brought something to his life that he had not even realized was missing, a warmth and joy that made even this beautiful valley seem brighter and more alive. He did not care about her size, he said, did not see it as a flaw or a burden. To him, she was perfect exactly as she was, a woman of courage and strength who had survived hardships that would have broken lesser people. He wanted her to stay not out of pity or charity, but because he could not imagine his life without her in it. The sincerity in his voice, the absolute conviction with which he spoke, broke down the last of Andrea's defenses. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to believe that she might actually be worthy of love, that someone might actually choose her, not despite her flaws, but because of who she was as a complete person. When Wayne reached for her, drawing her into his arms with gentle hands, Andrea did not resist. She melted against him, feeling the strength of his embrace and the steady beating of his heart beneath her cheek. For long moments, they simply held each other, and Andrea felt years of loneliness and pain beginning to heal in the warmth of his acceptance. That night, Wayne gave her the loft bedroom while he slept on a cot near the fireplace downstairs. But Andrea lay awake for hours, staring up at the rough-hewn beams and thinking about the choice before her. She could return to town, to her sister's house, and the life of quiet desperation she had always known. Or she could stay here, in this mountain paradise, and build a new life with a man who saw her as she had always dreamed of being seen. By morning, her decision was made. When Wayne climbed the ladder to wake her, he found her already dressed and waiting, her face glowing with a determination he had never seen there before. She told him that she wanted to stay, that she wanted to make a life with him in this beautiful place, and the joy that transformed his features was like watching the sun rise over the mountains. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Wayne began teaching Andrea the skills she would need to thrive in their mountain home. He showed her how to tend the gardens, how to preserve food for the long winter months, how to read the signs that predicted changes in the weather. She proved to be an apt student, eager to learn and quick to master new skills. But more than that, Andrea began to discover parts of herself that had been hidden for years beneath layers of shame and self-doubt. Away from the critical eyes of town society, free from the constant pressure to apologize for her existence, she began to blossom like a flower that had finally found the right soil and sunlight. She found that she had a natural talent for cooking, creating meals from Wayne's stores and the wild plants he showed her that were more delicious than anything she had ever prepared in her sister's kitchen. She discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, capable of physical work that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. Most importantly, she began to see herself through Wayne's eyes, to understand that the qualities she had always seen as flaws might actually be strengths. Her size, which had always made her feel awkward and unwelcome, gave her a presence and solidity that Wayne found comforting and attractive. Her gentleness, which others had seen as weakness, was exactly what he needed after years of hardness and solitude. As the days turned into weeks, Andrea and Wayne fell into a rhythm of life that felt as natural as breathing. They worked together during the day, tending the gardens and caring for the animals, preparing for the winter that would soon lock them into their valley paradise. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, talking and reading, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their future. The physical attraction between them grew stronger with each passing day, But Wayne was careful not to pressure her, understanding that she needed time to fully trust in his acceptance of her. When they finally came together as man and wife, it was with a tenderness and passion that left Andrea breathless with wonder at the beauty of physical love when shared between two people who truly cherished each other. But their happiness was not destined to remain undisturbed forever. On a crisp morning in early autumn, as the aspens were beginning to turn gold and the air carried the first hint of winter, Wayne returned from checking his trap lines with news that made Andrea's blood run cold. He had found signs that men on horseback had been in the area, following trails that led toward their hidden valley. The men who had been hunting Andrea had not given up their pursuit. Somehow, impossibly, they had tracked her into the high country and were now closing in on the sanctuary that had seemed so perfectly safe. Wayne's face was grim as he told her what he had discovered. But there was no fear in his pale eyes, only a cold determination that reminded Andrea of the predator she had glimpsed in him that first day. He began making preparations immediately, checking his weapons and laying in supplies for what might be a prolonged siege. The narrow pass that provided the only entrance to their valley could be defended by one man against many, he told her, and he had spent years preparing for exactly this sort of threat. But Andrea could see the worry beneath his calm exterior, could sense that he was not telling her everything about the danger they faced. That evening, as they sat by the fire making final preparations for the confrontation that seemed inevitable, Wayne told her something that made her heart race with terror. The men hunting her were not just common criminals seeking to eliminate a witness to their crimes. They were part of a larger organization, a network of outlaws and corrupt officials who controlled much of the territory through fear and violence. The leader of the group, the scarred man Andrea had seen that first day, was someone Wayne knew from his past, someone who had good reason to want both of them dead. Years ago, when Wayne had still been a soldier, he had been responsible for breaking up one of their operations, sending several of their members to prison and costing them thousands of dollars in stolen goods. Now it seemed they had finally tracked him down, and Andrea's presence had given them the perfect excuse to finish what they had started years before. They would not be content simply to kill her and leave Wayne alone. They wanted revenge, and they would not stop until both of them were dead. The knowledge that she had brought this danger into Wayne's peaceful life filled Andrea with guilt and despair. If she had never come here, if she had never accepted his offer of help, he would still be safe in his mountain paradise. Now, because of her, he was facing the possibility of losing everything he had built, perhaps even his life. But when she tried to voice these thoughts, Wayne stopped her with a look that was both fierce and tender. He told her that he regretted nothing, that the months they had shared together had been worth any price he might have to pay. If their enemies wanted to take their happiness away, they would have to fight for it. And Wayne Carter had never backed down from a fight in his life. The attack came at dawn, just as Wayne had predicted. Andrea woke to the sound of gunshots echoing off the valley walls, and she knew that their peaceful interlude was over. Wayne was already up and dressed, his rifle in his hands, and his face set in lines of grim determination. He kissed her quickly, fiercely, and then he was gone, slipping out into the gray morning light to face their enemies. From the cabin windows, Andrea could see muzzle flashes among the rocks near the pass, could hear the sharp crack of rifles and the shouted curses of angry men. Wayne had positioned himself perfectly, she realized, using the natural defenses of the valley to maximum advantage. The narrow pass created a bottleneck that forced their attackers to come at him one or two at a time, and his superior knowledge of the terrain gave him every advantage. But there were at least 6 men out there, maybe more, and Wayne was only one man, no matter how skilled or determined. As the battle raged on, Andrea began to fear that sheer numbers would eventually overwhelm even his tactical advantages. She could not simply sit in the cabin and wait to see if the man she loved would live or die. She had to do something to help, even if it meant putting herself in danger. Remembering the lessons Wayne had taught her about moving through the wilderness unseen, Andrea slipped out of the cabin and began working her way toward the battle. She stayed low, using the cover of rocks and brush to conceal her movement, and gradually made her way to a position where she could see what was happening near the pass. Wayne was exactly where she had expected to find him, crouched behind a boulder that provided perfect cover while giving him clear fields of fire toward the pass. His shooting was methodical and precise, and she could see that he had already taken a toll on their attackers. But even as she watched, she saw more men working their way around the flanks of his position, trying to get behind him where his cover would be useless. Andrea knew she had to warn him, but she also knew that calling out would reveal her position and put them both in even greater danger. Instead, she began working her way closer, using every trick Wayne had taught her about moving silently through difficult terrain. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, forcing her body to move with a stealth and precision that seemed impossible given her size. But desperation gave her strength and skill she had never known she possessed. She reached Wayne's position just as the flanking attack began, and her whispered warning allowed him to turn and meet the threat before it could overwhelm him. Together they fought with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, Andrea loading weapons while Wayne fired, both of them moving with an efficiency born of perfect trust and understanding. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though Andrea knew it could not have been more than minutes. The sound of gunfire echoed off the valley walls like thunder, and the air filled with smoke that stung her eyes and made breathing difficult. But gradually the volume of return fire began to diminish, and Andrea realized that Wayne's tactical superiority was telling. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost deafening. Wayne remained in position for several minutes, watching for any sign of movement among the rocks, before finally allowing himself to relax. When he turned to look at Andrea, his face was streaked with powder smoke, and his eyes were bright with the aftermath of battle. But he was smiling. They had won. Against impossible odds, they had defended their valley and their life together. The men who had hunted Andrea across hundreds of miles of wilderness were dead or fled, and the threat that had hung over their happiness was finally ended. As they made their way back to the cabin, Wayne told Andrea how proud he was of her courage, how her warning had saved both their lives. She had proven herself to be not just his partner in love, but his partner in every sense of the word, someone who could be counted on when the stakes were highest. But Andrea barely heard his words of praise. She was thinking about what had just happened, about the way she had moved through the wilderness with a skill and stealth that should have been impossible for someone of her size and inexperience. She had discovered something about herself in those desperate moments, something that changed the way she saw herself forever. She was not the weak, helpless burden she had always believed herself to be. She was strong, capable, worthy of the love and respect Wayne had always shown her. The woman who had hidden behind that tree weeks ago, terrified and convinced of her own worthlessness, was gone forever. In her place stood someone new, someone who had proven herself in the crucible of life and death. That evening, as they sat by their fire and tended to the minor wounds they had sustained in the battle, Wayne asked Andrea to marry him. Not because he felt obligated to protect her, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because he could not imagine spending his life with anyone else. She was his partner, his equal, the other half of his soul, and he wanted the whole world to know it. Andrea's answer came without hesitation, spoken with a confidence and certainty that would have been impossible just months before. Yes, she would marry him. Yes, she would spend her life in this mountain paradise, building something beautiful and lasting with the man who had shown her what love really meant. They were married that winter, in a ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who had somehow found his way to their hidden valley. The wedding was simple but perfect, witnessed by the mountains themselves and blessed by the love that had transformed them both from lonely, wounded people into something greater than either could have been alone. As spring returned to the valley and the wildflowers began to bloom again, Andrea stood on the porch of their cabin and looked out over the paradise they had defended and preserved. She thought about the woman she had been, the woman who had believed herself too heavy to mount a horse, too much of a burden for anyone to truly love. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth, who understood that love was not about being perfect, but about being perfectly matched to another imperfect soul. Wayne had lifted her not just onto his horse that first day, but into a new understanding of herself and what she was capable of becoming. The mountain wind stirred her hair as she watched Wayne working in their garden, his movements sure and economical as he tended the plants that would feed them through another year. He looked up and caught her watching him, and the smile that transformed his weathered features was like watching the sun rise over the peaks that surrounded their valley. She had found her home, her purpose, her destiny in this impossible place. She had found herself, and in doing so, she had found everything she had ever dreamed of, and more. Side news. The woman who had once believed she was too heavy to be lifted had learned to soar on wings she had never known she possessed. As the seasons turned and their first year together became their second, then their third, Andrea and Wayne built a life that was richer and more fulfilling than either had dared to imagine. Their love deepened with each passing day, strengthened by shared hardships and common purpose, seasoned by the kind of intimacy that comes only from truly knowing and accepting another person completely. Andrea discovered that she had a gift for the healing arts, learning to use the mountain plants Wayne showed her to treat everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses. Word of her skill somehow spread beyond their hidden valley, and occasionally travelers would find their way to their door seeking help for ailments that the doctors in town could not cure. She never turned anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay or the circumstances that had brought them to her door. Wayne would watch with pride as she worked, seeing in her gentle competence the same strength and determination that had carried her through their first desperate flight into the mountains. Their cabin grew as their needs changed, with Wayne adding rooms and improvements that made their home even more comfortable and beautiful. A workshop where Andrea could prepare her medicines, a larger kitchen to accommodate the guests who increasingly found their way to their valley, a library where they could store the books that arrived with every supply train Wayne made to the outside world. But the most important addition came in their fourth year together, when Andrea realized that she was carrying Wayne's child. The news filled them both with a joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. The final proof that their love had created something lasting and beautiful that would outlive them both. Wayne was tenderness itself during her pregnancy, treating her as if she were made of the finest porcelain while still respecting her strength and independence. He built a cradle from wood he had seasoned for 2 years, carving it with intricate designs that told the story of their love and their life together in the mountains. Their daughter was born on a spring morning when the valley was carpeted with wildflowers, and she was perfect in every way. They named her Hope because that was what she represented to them, the promise that love could triumph over any obstacle, that two broken people could create something whole and beautiful together. As Hope grew, she became the living embodiment of everything Andrea and Wayne had built together. She was strong and fearless like her father, but gentle and compassionate like her mother. She learned to ride before she could properly walk, to track animals through the forest before she could read, to find her way through the mountain wilderness as easily as other children navigated city streets. But more than that, Hope represented the future, the continuation of the life they had built in their hidden valley. She would grow up knowing that she was loved and valued for exactly who she was, never doubting her worth or her place in the world. She would never experience the pain and rejection that had scarred both her parents, because she would be raised in an environment of unconditional acceptance and love. As Andrea watched her daughter playing in the meadow outside their cabin, chasing butterflies and laughing with pure joy, she marveled at how much her life had changed since that terrible day when she had hidden behind a tree, certain that she was going to die alone and unmourned. The woman she had been then seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. She had learned that strength came in many forms, that love could transform even the most damaged soul. That home was not a place but a feeling, a sense of belonging that came from being truly known and accepted by another person. She had learned that she was not too heavy to be lifted, too much trouble to be worth saving, too broken to be made whole again. Wayne found her there in the meadow, watching their daughter with the soft smile that never failed to make his heart race even after all these years. He sat beside her in the grass, his arm going around her waist in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing, and together they watched Hope chase clouds across the perfect blue sky. They had built something beautiful here, something that would endure long after they were gone. Their love had created not just a child, but a legacy, a testament to the power of acceptance and understanding to heal even the deepest wounds. They had proven that fairy tales could come true, that mountain men could be princes, that women who believed themselves unworthy of love could become queens of their own perfect kingdoms. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Andrea leaned against Wayne's shoulder and felt the deep contentment that came from a life lived fully and without regret. She had found her happily ever after in this hidden valley, and she knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, as they always had, as they always would. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. In the distance, an eagle soared on the thermals rising from the sun-warmed rocks, its cry echoing off the peaks that surrounded their valley like the walls of a cathedral. Andrea closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her world. Wayne's steady breathing, Hope's distant laughter, the gentle murmur of the stream that had given them water for their gardens and music for their evenings. This was home. This was love. This was the life she had never dared to dream was possible. She had been lifted, not just onto a horse, but into a new understanding of herself and what she was capable of becoming. She had learned to soar on wings she had never known she possessed, to find strength in places she had never thought to look, to believe in love even when everything in her past told her it was impossible. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and changes, but none that could shake the foundation of love and trust that Andrea and Wayne had built together. Hope grew into a young woman who embodied the best qualities of both her parents, strong and independent, but also compassionate and wise beyond her years. She chose to stay in the valley when she came of age, building her own cabin nearby and starting a family of her own with a young man who had found his way to their hidden paradise much as Wayne had once found Andrea. Andrea became a grandmother, then a great-grandmother, watching as their family grew and flourished in the mountain sanctuary they had created. Each new generation carried forward the values and traditions that she and Wayne had established. The understanding that love was not about perfection, but about acceptance. That strength came in many forms. That home was wherever people chose to build it together. As Andrea aged, her hair turning silver and her step growing slower, she never lost the sense of wonder and gratitude that had filled her heart since that first day when Wayne had lifted her onto his horse. She had lived a life beyond her wildest dreams, had found love and purpose and meaning in ways she had never imagined possible. Wayne aged beside her, his auburn hair fading to white, but his pale eyes still holding the same warmth and love that had first captured her heart. They spent their later years sitting on the porch of their cabin, watching their grandchildren play in the meadow where Hope had once chased butterflies, sharing stories and memories and the comfortable silence of two people who had shared a lifetime together. When Wayne's time finally came, he died as he had lived, peacefully and surrounded by love. Andrea held his hand as he drew his last breath, whispering words of love and gratitude for the life they had shared, the family they had created, the legacy they would leave behind. Even in her grief, she felt blessed to have known such love, to have been chosen by such a man, to have shared such a perfect life in their mountain paradise. Andrea lived for several more years after Wayne's passing, tended by her daughter and grandchildren, still serving as the valley's healer and wise woman. She never remarried, never felt the need to seek love elsewhere, because what she had shared with Wayne had been complete and perfect and eternal. When her own time came, she faced it without fear, knowing that she had lived fully and loved deeply, that she had transformed from a woman who believed herself unworthy of love into someone who had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. She had proven that fairy tales could come true, that mountain men could be princes, that women who saw themselves as burdens could become the foundation upon which entire families were built. Her last thoughts were of that first day, of the moment when Wayne had reached down from his great horse and lifted her not just to safety, but to a new understanding of what was possible. She had told him she was too heavy to mount a horse, and he had shown her that she was light enough to soar among the eagles. The mountain wind whispered through the pines as Andrea drew her final breath, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of spring. In the distance, an eagle soared on the thermals rising from the sun-warmed rocks, its cry echoing off the peaks that had sheltered her love story for so many years. Her family gathered to lay her to rest beside Wayne in the meadow, where they had watched their daughter play, where they had dreamed their dreams and built their life together. The simple headstone bore only their names in a single line. They lifted each other to heights they never thought possible. The Hidden Valley continued to thrive long after Andrea and Wayne were gone, their descendants carrying forward the values and traditions they had established. The story of their love became legend, passed down from generation to generation, a reminder that true love could overcome any obstacle, that acceptance and understanding could heal any wound, that home was not a place but a feeling that could be created anywhere two people chose to build it together. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the mountain wind stirred the pines and the eagles soared overhead, visitors to the valley swore they could still feel their presence, still sense the love that had transformed a lonely mountain man and a woman who believed herself unworthy into something greater than either could have been alone. Their love story had become part of the mountain itself, woven into the very fabric of the place they had chosen to call home. It served as proof that fairy tales could come true, that love could triumph over any obstacle, that two broken people could create something whole and beautiful and eternal. The woman who had once believed she was too heavy to be lifted had learned to soar, and in doing so, she had shown others that they too could rise above their limitations, could find love and acceptance and purpose in the most unlikely places. Her legacy lived on in every act of kindness, every moment of acceptance, every time someone chose to see past surface appearances to the heart beneath. Andrea Robinson had found her happily ever after in a hidden valley high in the mountains, and her story continued to inspire long after she was gone, a testament to the transformative power of love and the infinite possibilities that opened up when two souls truly recognized and accepted each other completely.